They cast the Kiowa woman into the shaft to die. She cried for mercy, but only one lone rider answered. The year is 1878, and the New Mexico sun beats down on Redemption Hollow, a forgotten speck of a town clinging to the dusty lip of the Pecos River. The air, thick with the scent of parched earth and desperation, shimmers with a heat that melts the horizon into a hazy line. This is a place where hope has long since been traded for survival, where the only promises are the next sunrise and the hunger in a man's gut. Weather-beaten shacks, their wood bleached white by relentless sun, huddled together like mourners at a grave. A mournful wind whips through the valley, carrying fine red dust that coats everything: the broken wagons, the grimy windows, the very breath in a man's lungs. In the midst of this desolate landscape rides Elias Thorne, a man who carries the weight of the land itself on his shoulders. At 35, his face is a map of hard-won experience, etched with deep lines of sun and sorrow. A faded canvas duster, frayed at the cuffs and stained with miles of trail dust, hangs from his gaunt frame. He rides with a limp from a bullet that never found its way out of his thigh, a reminder of a past he can't outrun. Elias is a man of few words and fewer attachments. He came for supplies, a sack of flour, a few cartridges, maybe some tobacco, and nothing more. He has no friends here, no one to wait for him. He is a ghost passing through a graveyard, his only companion the silent rhythm of the saddle. Just as he nears the center of the settlement, a sound slices through the oppressive quiet, a cry thin, desperate, clawing up from the earth itself, the terrified wail of a woman, raw with agony. It echoes from the old, abandoned mineshaft, long the subject of hushed warnings. Someone has been thrown down there to die. The rational choice is to keep riding, to pretend he heard nothing. But the cry rips at something buried deep, a shard of humanity he thought rusted away. Without hesitation, Elias pulls his mare to a stop, his hand moving to the worn handle of the Colt Peacemaker on his hip. The dust settled around Elias's boots as he dismounted, every creak of saddle leather too loud in the silence. He tied his horse, a stoic roan named Gideon, outside the trading post. The place smelled of stale coffee, old leather, and the sourness of unwashed men. Elias bought what he needed with few words: flour, 45 cartridges, a pouch of tobacco. The plan was simple: ride out, make camp near the dried-up creek bed, be gone before nightfall, gone before the town noticed him. Then he heard it again, at first faint, like the wind in broken boards, a voice, a plea, weak and trembling. Help! The word carried on a gust of wind. Elias froze, instincts of a hunter sharpening. He followed the sound to the abandoned mine shaft. Its frame was rotted, the winch long gone. Peering into the glare of the setting sun, he saw her, a young woman, a Kiowa by her dress and features. Her dark hair was tangled, her skin scraped raw. She lay crumpled at the bottom, one arm twisted at a wrong angle, her dress torn where the fall had caught her. Sweat streaked the dirt on her face. She looked up when his shadow cut the light, her lips whispering not to leave her. Elias's jaw tightened. He knew this townsfolk. If she was down there, someone had put her there. He didn't need to ask why. He didn't need to call others. No one would come. For a moment he hesitated. Riding on meant safety, a return to the lonely comfort of his life. She wasn't his responsibility. Every time he had stopped before, it had cost him blood and grief. His past was full of voices he hadn't saved, the memory of a small boy he failed to protect. He had sworn never to get tangled in another's fate. But something in the way she struggled to her knees, even with her arm useless, struck him. A refusal to give up, defiance in the face of death that he recognized in his own soul. He couldn't walk away. Not again. Elias pulled his rope from the saddle, tied it around a sturdy beam, and lowered it. His voice carried down, steady and controlled. Take hold. Use your good arm. She blinked up at him, uncertain if she could trust a stranger, a white man. Fear crossed her face, but she had no choice. Her trembling fingers closed around the rope. Elias braced his boots and hauled back, every muscle straining. The rope creaked, grit tore at her palms, and she gasped with each pull. His shoulder burned, his thighs screamed, but he didn't stop. Inch by inch she rose, scraping stone, twisting with pain. When her hand finally cleared the rim, Elias grabbed her wrist and hauled her onto solid ground. She collapsed against him, breathing hard, her dress in tatters. Her cleavage showed where the fabric had ripped, and she pulled it together quickly, eyes flashing with shame. Elias didn't look away. He draped his dust coat over her, steady and firm. She went still beneath it, her chest heaving. She was young, no more than 20, bruised and swelling across the arms, a mark on her cheek. Her eyes, dark and sharp even through pain, met his with defiance and relief. He let out a long breath. The question of leaving her was already gone. He couldn't. Not this time. He hooked an arm under her knees, lifted her carefully despite her wince, and set her across Gideon. His own leg burned with the weight, but he ignored it. She was light, too light. He started leading the horse toward the hills. Elias's thoughts stayed sharp. He didn't know her name or story, but he knew enough. She had been left to die, and no one else had answered her voice. That was reason enough. As the town shrank behind them, he felt the weight of a decision settle in his chest, the kind you couldn't walk back from. He had tied himself to her fate the moment he pulled her from the dark. He had chosen to re-enter a world he tried to leave behind, a world of pain and responsibility. And for the first time in years, the choice didn't feel like a curse. It felt like redemption. If you enjoy the story, hit that subscribe button right away. And if you don't, then just hit the like button anyway to keep more Wild West love stories coming. Elias led Gideon steadily up the dry trail toward the hills, his boots dragging in the dirt with each uneven step. Selah lay slumped across the saddle, clutching his coat around her chest, her injured arm tucked close to her ribs. Her breathing was shallow, every bump drawing a faint wince. The sun dropped lower, throwing long shadows, and Elias knew he had only an hour before night closed in. He had no intention of keeping her near the town where she'd been thrown into that shaft. No one there would care if she lived or died. He glanced at her face, catching her eyes open, sharp with suspicion. She didn't trust him. She shifted slightly away, even as she relied on him. That was natural. He was a stranger, a white man, and those who had hurt her looked like him. Elias's thoughts tightened. He hadn't seen the men at the mine, but he could guess. Drunken hands, quick to hate, accusing her without proof. Easier to blame a Kiowa woman than admit their own faults. He had seen it before, in a dozen towns. He stopped once to check her arm. The joint was swollen, twisted at the elbow in a way that made his stomach turn. She tried to pull away, jaw clenched, but he caught her gaze and spoke low. "It needs binding. You'll lose the use of it if it's left like this." She didn't answer, but she stopped resisting, watching him tie the arm tight with strips of cloth from an old feed sack. His movements were steady, never lingering. By the time they reached his camp, the light thinned into blue and the air cooled. His camp was nothing more than a fire pit, a lean-to of pine branches, and a canvas roll. He had always traveled light, a man without roots, and tonight it would have to serve for two. Elias lifted her gently from the horse, setting her down near the fire pit. She was too weak to stand, her good hand clinging to his sleeve before she caught herself and let go. Elias lit the fire quickly, sparks catching on mesquite twigs until flames spread. Shadows revealed the bruise at her temple and raw scrapes along her collarbone. She adjusted the coat to cover her torn dress. Elias said nothing, only placed a tin cup of water in her hand. She drank too fast, water spilling down her chin. "Name?" he asked after a silence. She hesitated, eyes narrowing, then answered rough. "Selah." He nodded. "Elias." Nothing more. He didn't ask her story. Both carried scars, plain enough. She shifted closer to the fire, gaze moving over his rifle, bedroll, supplies. He could almost hear the unspoken question. Why had he helped? He spoke more than usual. "I heard you." That was enough. Her eyes held his for a moment before she looked away. He cooked a small pot of beans and shared half. She ate with her good hand, pride stiffening her movements, though hunger was clear. When finished, she leaned back against the saddle, closing her eyes. She didn't let herself sleep until he settled nearby, rifle across his knees. Elias sat there long after her breathing evened out. He knew what it meant. The men who had thrown her down would not welcome her survival. If they discovered he had saved her, he would be marked too. He could leave her at first light, but his gut told him he wouldn't. The fire burned low when dawn broke, smoke curling above the coals. Elias had not slept more than a few minutes, his rifle still balanced across his lap. Coyotes cried in the distance. When he turned to check, Selah lay under his coat, chest rising steady. She looked younger in sleep, suspicion gone. Elias stood slowly, testing his leg before putting weight on it. The limp was worse in the morning. He fed branches into the fire, then walked to the creek bed half a mile away to fill the canteen. He moved quickly, knowing she shouldn't be left alone long. If men followed the tracks, she would be vulnerable. When he returned, she was awake, sitting upright, clutching his coat. Her eyes tracked him the whole way, tense until she saw it was him. Elias noted the look, fear sharpened into readiness. She was prepared to run or fight even in her state. He crouched by the fire, poured water into a tin, and passed it to her. She drank slowly this time. He noticed her arm again, the swelling worse. The cloth he had tied held, but it wouldn't last. He needed a proper splint. "Keep it still," Elias said. "Can't risk it healing wrong." Her gaze didn't leave him. "Why help me?" Her voice was quiet but weighty. Elias hesitated. He could have brushed it aside, but she deserved more than silence. "Because I've heard voices before and didn't answer. Couldn't live with that again." He kept his eyes on the fire. She studied him, then gave a single nod. No thanks, no softening, but she let it rest. He worked on a splint, cutting branches to size and binding them with strips from his bedroll. When he touched her arm again, she flinched, biting back a sound. "Hold still," he said, not unkindly, and she did. His hands were steady, practiced from years of tending wounds. When he finished, he saw sweat on her brow, but also relief. She tested it carefully, then eased. He gave her beans again, and this time she ate slower, eyes on him as if weighing what kind of man he was. Elias said little, but he knew she was studying every move, how he kept his rifle close, how often he scanned the ridge, how his limp didn't stop him from moving like a man ready for trouble. She was weighing him, and he waited for her judgment. If you like Wild West love stories or Wild West stories, drop a bunch of 1 second, and your place in the comments for the Wild West Love channel. Tell me where you're listening from so I don't feel so alone out here. When the meal was done, Selah finally spoke again, her voice firmer now. "They said I stole corn," she muttered, her voice flat. She looked down at her hands as she spoke. "I went to the storeroom to ask for scraps. They refused. That night, sacks were torn. They blamed me." She raised her eyes then, locking on his. "I took nothing." Elias held her stare, knife still in his hand as he whittled a piece of wood. "I believe you." He meant it. He had seen enough false blame laid at her people's feet to know the truth without proof. She seemed startled at his certainty, as though she expected doubt, even from the man who had pulled her from the shaft. She lowered her eyes to the fire, but not before he caught the flicker of something, gratitude or perhaps relief. The day stretched on and Elias tended to Gideon, checked his rifle, and set traps near the creek. Selah sat quietly for a long time, then began to move around camp, using her good arm to stack wood and clear stones. He saw the effort it cost her, but he didn't stop her. Work steadied the mind, and he knew she needed to feel something other than helplessness. By late afternoon, the camp looked different. Not much, but enough. A cleared space, a steadier fire, water stored in a pot. She sat down across from him, her hair falling loose around her face, and for the first time, her eyes softened. "You could have left me there," she said, not as a question, but as a statement of fact. Elias gave a short nod. "I didn't." That night, as the fire burned low again, she shifted closer to its heat. The desert chill had settled in. He laid his blanket wide, motioning once. She hesitated, pride holding her back, then sat beside him. They didn't speak, but when her shoulder brushed his arm, Elias didn't move away. He stared into the flames, knowing the decision he had made was no small thing. He hadn't meant to take anyone into his life again. Yet here she was, wrapped in his coat, her breathing steady beside him, and he knew there was no turning back. Morning came, with a gray sky, the air cooler than the day before. Elias rose before the fire had gone out, feeding it with dry wood until flames caught again. He moved slow, his limp more pronounced after sleeping on the ground, but he kept his steps steady. When he turned back, Sela was already awake, sitting upright, the coat still wrapped around her shoulders. She had not slept deeply. He could tell by the tightness around her eyes. She tried to stand, bracing herself on her good arm. Elias saw it before it happened. Her legs buckled, her balance gone. He stepped forward quickly, catching her under the arms before she hit the ground. Her body tensed at his grip, pride stiffening her back, but she didn't push him away. She was too weak. Elias lowered her onto a flat stone near the fire, his expression calm, though inside he felt the knot of worry tighten. "You shouldn't push yet," he said. His tone was firm, but even. She kept her eyes fixed on the fire, jaw set, breathing sharp through her nose. He recognized it, pride cut by humiliation. He had felt it himself too many times after the gunshot in his thigh left him limping for life. He crouched down beside her, speaking quieter. "Your body needs time. Walking now will break you worse." She didn't answer, but her eyes flicked toward him. He saw in them the fight, her refusal to be helpless, her fear of depending on a man she barely knew. To ease the weight of silence, Elias spoke about boiling water in the tin, dropping in strips of dried venison. The smell rose slow, filling the camp with something solid. He placed the cup in her hand when it was ready. "Drink. It'll keep you steady." While she drank, Elias thought of the town again. He'd seen towns where the law bent to the loudest voices. A sheriff might look the other way. Bringing her back would buy her nothing. The law in towns like that served the loudest voices, not the quiet ones. The sheriff, if he knew it all, would look the other way. To them, a Kiowa woman was no more than trouble, an easy scapegoat when grain went missing. That was why Elias hadn't carried her back. He didn't need to test it. He already knew. After the meal, he began checking the traps he had set the day before. Sela tried to rise again, slower this time. Elias watched from the corner of his eye, not moving to stop her. She took 3 careful steps, swaying but holding upright, her good arm gripping a branch she had found for balance. She stood there a long moment, breathing hard, then lowered herself back to sit. Elias returned with a rabbit from the traps, setting it down near the fire without comment. Her small effort to walk had told him what he needed. She wasn't giving up. His tone didn't waver. She searched his face as if testing for a crack, some sign of doubt. She found none. She looked away quickly, but he caught the faint shift in her shoulders, the smallest easing of tension. As the day warmed, Elias showed her how to keep the splint steady, how to hold her arm against her side when she walked. She listened, her eyes following every move. At midday, when he poured water over the cloth to cool the swelling, his fingers brushed against her skin. She flinched at the touch, not from pain, but from something else. He didn't pull back, only steadied the cloth and tied it tighter. Her breathing caught, then smoothed. By evening, the camp carried a new rhythm. She fetched wood with her good hand, awkward but determined. While Elias cooked, he caught her glancing at him now and then, studying the scar on his cheek, the limp when he shifted weight, the quiet way he moved. She was measuring him, he realized, deciding if he was truly different from the men who had left her to die. When the fire dimmed that night, the cold pressed in again. Elias laid out his blanket as before. She hesitated longer this time, pride fighting need, but finally lowered herself onto the blanket beside him. Her shoulder brushed his arm once more. Neither moved away. She pulled the coat tighter, and Elias kept his eyes on the fire, though he felt the warmth of her leaning close. The thought crossed his mind too. Would he leave her once she could stand, once her strength returned? But he felt the answer settle in him with more certainty than he liked. He had carried her from the shaft. He had bound her wound. And now, sitting shoulder to shoulder in silence, He knew leaving was no longer a choice he would make. "Hey there, friend, take a moment and get yourself a full glass of water. It's easy to forget, but staying hydrated is crucial for your health. Also, if you've been sitting for a while, do a quick lap around the room and give your eyes a break from the screen. Your body will thank you." The next morning broke clear. The sky washed pale blue as the desert cooled from the night. Elias stirred the fire back to life with practiced movements, his shoulders rolling stiff from sleep. He had gotten used to waking to nothing but silence. But now there was another sound, her steady breathing, a faint cough, the rustle of cloth as she shifted beneath his coat. Selah sat up slowly, her hair tangled and dark around her face, her injured arm cradled close. The tension was still there, a thin line across her brow, but it was less pronounced. Elias passed her a tin cup of water, then bread softened in the broth from last night's rabbit. She ate carefully, trying to use both hands out of habit before realizing again that she could not. He noticed the flicker of frustration, the set of her jaw, as she forced herself to continue with only her good hand. To ease her pride, he didn't comment, just cut his own bread one-handed, showing her it could be done without shame. She caught him doing it, her eyes narrowing, but she said nothing. When the meal was done, she stood again, steadier than the day before, though her steps were slow. Elias followed her movements with a careful eye. She went to the creek, filled the pot, and carried it back against her hip. The water sloshed, wetting her dress, but she did not falter. Elias felt something shift watching her, the way she fought against her weakness, the way she refused to stay seated when her body begged her to. Later, while he mended the strap of his saddle, she came to sit across from him, her gaze fixed on his hands, rough and scarred, threading leather with precise motions. After a long silence, she spoke. "You were soldier?" He paused, then gave a slow nod. "Scout. Army, years back." His voice was flat, not inviting questions, but her eyes pressed for more. "You kill?" she asked quietly, not with accusation, but with blunt curiosity. Elias tightened the strap and looked at her directly. "Yes, too many." The words came out low, heavy with memory. She didn't look away, only studied him with the same steady gaze she had held at the fire. Then she nodded once, as if the answer explained something she had already suspected. She did not ask again. She reached for his sleeve suddenly, holding the edge where it had torn near the shoulder. With her good hand, she pulled a needle and thread from the small pouch at her waist. He hadn't noticed it before, tucked beneath the folds of her dress. Slowly, awkwardly, with one arm, she began stitching. Her fingers trembled, her motions uneven, but she worked until the cloth held. Elias sat still, watching her concentration, the way she pressed her lip between her teeth as she pulled the thread tight. When she finished, she handed it back without a word. "Good work," Elias said quietly, genuinely. She met his eyes briefly, then looked away, but he caught the faint lift in her expression. A small pride breaking through the exhaustion. Through the afternoon, they worked side by side without planning it. Elias set new traps. She gathered mesquite pods for the fire. He cleaned his rifle. She washed the cooking tin at the creek. Their movements fit together in a rhythm, not through talk, but through watching and responding. Each time she struggled with her arm, Elias moved as if to help, but she shook her head, forcing herself to finish. He let her, understanding she needed to hold on to what strength she had left. That evening, as the fire burned strong, Selah shifted closer than before, her shoulder nearly against his. She hesitated, then placed her hand lightly on his. Her skin was warm, the touch brief at first, then steady. Elias didn't move away. He turned his hands so their palms met, fingers resting against hers. The silence between them carried more than words could. She leaned against him after, her head resting against his chest. For the first time, Elias allowed himself to breathe deep, feeling the weight of another person pressed to him, not in battle, not in grief, but in quiet trust. His mind flicked back to the shaft, to the moment he had almost walked away. He knew now he never could have. As the night settled and her breathing slowed against him, Elias realized the camp no longer felt like a place for just one man. Her presence had changed it. And though no promises had been spoken, he felt the truth settle heavy and certain. He had tied his life to hers the moment he pulled her from the dark. The night stretched long, the fire burning down to embers, the desert wind carrying grit across the camp. Elias lay with his back to the saddle, Selah leaning against him, her breathing light and steady. He had grown used to silence. But this was different, the kind that carried warmth instead of emptiness. For years he had known only the weight of his own thoughts, the echo of old battles, the names of men long gone. Now there was another heartbeat close to his, another presence filling the space that had been hollow for too long. When dawn came, the world was hushed, the sky washed pale gold. Elias rose quietly, not to wake her, and stoked the fire until it caught again. He boiled water for coffee, the bitter smell filling the camp. He glanced back at her as she stirred awake, her eyes opening slow, weary at first before softening when they settled on him. For the first time, he saw something in her gaze that wasn't just suspicion or guarded pride. It was trust, tentative but real. She shifted, trying to move her splinted arm. A hiss of pain escaped before she caught it. Elias crouched beside her, checking the cloth. "Swelling's gone down some," he said, "steady as always. You'll have use of it again in time." She studied him, her voice quiet. "You know how to heal." "Had to learn," he answered. "Army didn't send doctors into the field. We patched each other up or we died." His words were plain, but she heard the edge beneath them, the years of watching too many not make it. She didn't press him, but her eyes lingered, as if weighing the cost he carried. That day, the rhythm of work began again. Elias checked the traps, skinned another rabbit. Selah insisted on helping more, gathering wood, grinding beans with her good hand. She moved slow, but he let her. Every small task she managed seemed to give her strength. At one point, she stumbled, carrying water back from the creek, nearly dropping the pot. Elias caught it with one hand before it spilled, steadying her with the other. She froze in his grip, their faces close, her breath sharp against his chin. Neither moved for a moment. Then she stepped back, her cheeks flushed, clutching the coat tighter around her. Elias let her go without a word. But the moment stayed. If you're watching on television, don't hesitate, grab your phone and hit subscribe to my channel so you'll never miss out on our amazing characters. By evening, the air cooled again. The sky was streaked with the bruised colors of dusk. Elias sharpened his knife while she sat across from him, sewing another tear in his coat. She worked slow, her head bent, hair falling across her cheek. He watched her longer than he should have, until she lifted her eyes and caught him. For the first time, she didn't look away. When the fire burned low, she shifted beside him again, closer than the nights before. Their shoulders touched, and after a moment, she turned, her face near his. Elias felt her hand brush against his chest, light but deliberate. His breath caught, though he held his composure. Her eyes searched his, asking without words if she was safe to cross this line. Elias, scarred by years of silence, found himself answering not with speech but with action. He lowered his head, his lips meeting hers. The kiss was cautious at first, the firelight casting their faces in a sharp glow. She pressed into him, her good hand resting against his jaw. Elias held her carefully, steadying her as though afraid she might break. When they parted, her forehead rested against his, her breath quick, her eyes closed. For the first time since he had pulled her from the shaft, he saw her without fear. Elias sat back slowly, his voice low, the words rough. "I won't take what's not freely given." She opened her eyes then, meeting his with a clarity that cut through the night. "I stay because I choose," she whispered. Her words were heavy with meaning, and Elias felt them settle deep, heavier than any vow. That night, they shared the blanket without hesitation. She curled against him, his arm careful around her waist. The campfire burned slow, the desert quiet beyond, and for the first time in years, Elias let himself rest, without one eye open. The presence beside him no longer a burden, but a promise. The next morning broke with a sharp wind pushing dust across the camp. Elias rose early, moving quietly to check the traps near the creek. His body felt lighter than it had in months. though he would never admit it aloud. When he returned, Selah was tending the fire, her good hand steady as she stirred a pot of beans. She looked up when she heard his steps, and for the first time, she didn't tense, as if expecting trouble. That change alone told him how far they had come, but peace never lasted long in places like this. By midday, Elias knew they couldn't stay hidden in the hills forever. He needed ammunition, flour, salt, supplies that would force him back into town. Selah saw it too. "You go back," she said quietly as they ate. "They will see me with you. They will hate it." Her voice was flat, but beneath it lay fear, though she tried to hide it. Elias met her gaze across the fire. "If I go back, I won't leave you here alone, and I won't hide you." His tone was calm, but final. He had already made his choice. She looked away, chewing slowly, but he caught the flicker in her eyes, part worry, part something else he couldn't name. By afternoon, Elias saddled Gideon and helped her up carefully, her injured arm cradled against her side. They rode down toward the settlement, the dry road stretching into view. Selah's body tensed as the first buildings came into sight, the memory of being dragged to the shaft still too fresh. Elias kept his hand near the rifle slung across his back, his jaw set. When they reached the trading post, the voices fell quiet. Men standing outside shifted, their eyes cutting toward Selah, then toward Elias. One spat into the dust, another muttered something about witch blood. Elias ignored them, tying the horse and leading her inside. He bought flour, cartridges, and coffee without haggling, his tone short but steady. Selah stayed close, her eyes low, but her posture straight. When they stepped out, 3 men blocked the way, faces he recognized from the mine shaft's edge the night he found her. Their expressions were tight, mouths curled in contempt. The tallest stepped forward, his hand resting near the grip of his revolver. "You took what wasn't yours," he said, nodding toward Selah. "Best turn her loose before more trouble comes. If you've made it this far, I know you're a true fan of WWL. From the bottom of my heart, I wish your day is filled with health and happiness, and may a little stroke of luck find you in the next 15 minutes. Don't forget to share it with me in the comments." Elias felt the old heat rise in his chest, the kind he had fought to bury. He shifted, bringing his stance square, his limp hidden by the weight of his posture. His voice carried low but sharp. "I pulled her from the shaft because leaving her there was murder. She stays with me now. Anyone with a quarrel can speak plain." The street went silent. The man's eyes flicked to Elias's rifle, then to the steadiness in his face. For a moment tension stretched like a drawn bow, then the man spat and stepped back. The others followed, muttering, but not drawing steel. Elias didn't move until they turned away. Selah's hand gripped his coat as they mounted the horse, her eyes fixed on the ground. He didn't need her words to know shame from being accused, fear of what might still come. He covered her hand briefly with his own, grounding her without words. They rode back into the hills, but Elias knew the matter wasn't settled. The men hadn't forgotten, and the town would whisper louder now. Back at camp, Selah sat long by the fire. Finally, she lifted her eyes. "You risked your life," she said softly. Her tone carried confusion, maybe gratitude. Elias answered with the only truth he had. "I don't walk away. Not from you." That night, she shifted closer under the blanket, her body pressed against his. Elias felt the weight of what had begun not a passing choice, but a bond tested against others' judgment. The night after their return was restless. Elias sat awake, firelight cutting across his face as Selah slept against his chest. He listened to every sound, the crack of branches, a coyote's cry, the faint whistle of wind. The men from town would not forget. Sooner or later, they would test him again. The thought stayed with him, but so did the memory of her hand gripping his coat in front of all. At dawn, Selah stirred, wincing as she shifted her arm. The swelling had eased slightly, but pain remained. Elias helped her rewrap the splint, his hands deliberate. She watched him closely, caught between gratitude and discomfort. "It's healing. You'll have strength back in time," he said. She nodded, lips pressed tight. That morning she asked, "Why do you live alone?" Genuine curiosity, not suspicion. Elias paused, the question cutting deeper than expected. Because I buried everyone I cared for. A wife, a child. Easier to keep to myself than watch more die. His words came out raw, stripped of anything but fact. Selah looked at him a long time. You saved me, she said, so maybe not easier anymore. Her words were simple but lodged in him deeper than anything had in years. That afternoon rain clouds gathered low. Elias pulled canvas across the lean-to while Selah steadied the fire. They worked side by side, smooth, no orders needed. When the rain broke, they sheltered together, drops striking hard against canvas. Selah sat close, damp air curling strands of her hair against her cheek. Elias brushed one away. She didn't flinch. Her hand found his, curling slowly around his rough palm. When she leaned toward him, Elias met her halfway. Their kiss was firm, searching. When she pulled back, her eyes held his with certainty. I'm not afraid when I am with you, she whispered. He drew her against him, arms steady, careful of her injury. They stayed like that until the storm passed, the desert washed clean. That night, fire burning strong, Selah spoke in fragments about her people raids that scattered them, hunger that drove her to the town that betrayed her. Elias listened, not pressing, only offering presence. When she faltered, he rested his hand over hers. Under the blanket they now shared, their closeness deepened. Her hand traced the scar at his chest, her breath warm. He held her carefully, with respect more than hesitation. For years, Elias had thought himself hollow, surviving only because his body refused to quit. Now, with her against him, he felt something new, belonging. The storm outside had passed, but he knew the one beyond camp still waited. And when it came, he would meet it, not alone. The morning after was crisp, the desert sky wide and pale. Elias rose early, checking traps and saddling Gideon. A quiet certainty filled him the time for drifting was past. Selah sat near the fire, wrapping his coat tighter. She watched him, reading his intent before he spoke. They won't leave this alone, Elias said evenly. If they see you alive with me, they'll push harder. Selah's jaw tightened, but she didn't look away. Then we faced them. Her voice was steady. Elias studied her, then gave a single nod. By midday, they rode back toward town, dust rising behind Gideon's hooves. Elias carried his rifle slung but ready, revolver heavy at his side. Selah rode in front, wrapped in his coat, her back straight despite her arm. Heads turned as they entered the main road. Whispers followed, the Kiowa woman alive, the quiet scout bringing her in plain sight. The same three men stood outside the saloon. One stepped forward, spitting into the dust. We told you to turn her loose. Elias dismounted slow and measured, his limp hidden by steadiness. His voice cut the silence. She stays with me. You try to take her again. You answer to me. The man's hand twitched toward his pistol, but Elias was faster. His revolver cleared before the other's fingers touched leather. The street froze. Elias's voice stayed level. You've shown what kind of men you are. Leave her be, or next time I won't stop at words. The crowd held still. Finally, the man's eyes faltered. He stepped back, muttering, but didn't draw steel. The others followed, bravado broken. Slowly, the town resumed its noise. Elias holstered his revolver, then offered his hand to Selah as she slid down from the saddle. In that look, something unspoken passed between them. What had begun as survival was becoming something more. They finished their business quickly, ignoring the stares. When they left, no one stopped them. The road back to the hills felt freer, as though judgment had been pushed aside. Back at camp, Elias began to cut logs, stacking them carefully. Selah watched, puzzled, until he spoke. This place was meant for passing through, but I'm done drifting. I want it to be ours. Her eyes widened, then softened. She rested her hand over his. You saved me from the shaft, she said quietly. Now you give me a place. Elias nodded, his voice rough. Not just a place, a life. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the ridges, they sat together near the fire, their shoulders touching, her head against his chest. There were no crowds, no whispers, no men waiting to strike, only the steady rhythm of two people who had chosen to stay. For Elias, it was the first time in years the silence felt whole instead of empty. For Selah, it was the first time she belonged without fear. The shaft had been meant to bury her,